There's a piece of video I want to show you. This is from the Persian language BBC website. It's BBC footage. It's presented in Farsi, and it's on their Farsi language site. This footage was taken on Saturday, which, as far as we can tell, was the last day of very large-scale protests in Iran. As we just discussed with Trita Parsi, there were still demonstrations yesterday and today in Iran, but presumably because of the huge security crackdown, demonstrations have been smaller since Saturday. But this footage that you're seeing here from the BBC website, this was taken Saturday, and it's kind of a reality check. What's going on in Iran is absolutely a fight over the alleged stealing of an election. It's absolutely a fight between candidates, between factions of the elite, between different elements of the regime. It is absolutely political, but it's also physical. This is demonstrating and fighting in the streets, and that means that physical tactics matter. What you're seeing in this footage is the riot police. They're the ones in the tan uniforms on the left side of your screen, and they're facing off against a crowd of opposition protesters. We assume that what the police here are throwing is tear gas canisters, although it's hard exactly to tell what they're doing because of the scale of the images. But now I want you to watch as the crowd, we'll go back to the tape in a second, and what you'll see is in the crowd on the top and right side of the screen, the crowd turns the tables on the riot police. And out of all the demonstrations I've ever attended and all the news footage I've ever seen of mass-scale protests, I don't think I've ever seen anything like this. Watch this. You can hear the people in the foreground shouting what sounds like hurrah, hurrah, as the riot police turn and run. Overwhelmed not only by the size of the crowd they're facing, but apparently by how emboldened the protesters are. And the protesters' tactics are not only bold in these huge groups in the streets, we've also had some reporting of small-scale tactical aggression by the opposition, including something our friend Steve Clemmons of the New America Foundation and the WashingtonNote.com has termed Basiji hunting. Steve Clemmons joins us now. Steve, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Good to be with you, Rachel.
First of all, tell us a little bit about the Basiji, and this idea of Basiji hunting that you wrote about at the Washington Note recently.
Well, first of all, the Basiji are a feared, intimidating, somewhat shadowy group of largely volunteers. They're not completely volunteers because they get stipends and university positions and certain other privileges in Iranian society for essentially being the goon squads for Ahmadinejad and the government. They report loosely to the Revolutionary Guard. There's a dispute about how many of them are out there, but they basically are a group that sort of hide in society without uniforms and without organization, and they go out and crack heads. And they are despised, and they are the ones most responsible for the nighttime raids and the terror raids on many homes, apartment buildings, and most importantly, I think most recently, the University of Tehran. And it was that Tehran University case that really began to change the way many of the communities began going after some of these Basiji more proactively.
In terms of going after them proactively, what you've been able to publicize at the WashingtonNote.com is essentially house-to-house targeting of the members of this militia. Is that right?
Well, it is. There was a case, I was very surprised when I got it, of an Iranian internationalist. I'd rather not say where he is, but he gave a compelling account which really caught my eye on how communities themselves all know each other and how they're not just playing into the victim mentality here. One part of this protest that Mr. Mousavi and his supporters are organizing is very much using nonviolent methods of marching and getting out there and using that to drive a conflict to essentially push the buttons of the government. But another dimension of it is not sitting back and having bad things happen to their community, their parents, their sisters, their brothers, and they've begun to sort of organize, if you will, in hard-edged neighborhood watch groups, and actually going out in a highly networked society and find family members of these people and track down these Basiji and go after them, turn the battle around. The Basiji were marking the homes of people that they were tracking during the day to go and terrorize them at night. And now what many communities in the sort of vigilante part of the protester community are now marking the Basiji in some cases and going after them. And I know what they're doing is telegraphing as best they can how they're doing this to other communities around Tehran and other cities in Iran.
Are they just trying to intimidate the members of the Basiji, or are they actually hurting or killing them?
It's unclear to me. I can't say no of killing. There are some cases where there is video out there of communities going after these young men on motorcycles, forcing them off the motorcycles, throwing bodies in front of the motorcycles to get them off, and then taking them and either beating them up. And there was a bit of SMS traffic for a while, trying to encourage these communities not to kill these Basiji, interestingly, and try to sort of draw them in and to reach communities and sort of talk about them about coming in and joining up and not doing this stuff. But these Basiji are complicated, and they have various odd reasons for wanting to belong to this group. Some are casual and some are hardcore fanatics who believe and who love the kind of violence they're deploying out there. So I think you've got a mixed bag of what's going on. And the reporting out, I have several clear incidences that I have been able to validate of them getting these Basiji and trying to turn them around or beat them up or to create family pressures for them.
Steve, with all your foreign policy experience and all that you've seen about revolutions and uprisings and insurgent movements and the ways that governments try to destroy those things, do you think that this represents some sort of turning point, tipping point, some sort of new phase in what's going on here? Is this tactically important to the overall likely success of this movement?
It's important for the narrative of the people not to be used just as victims, and that they see some pathway forward. That for many of the people who are just average bystanders, they need to be able to see some pathway forward that's going to make some sense. And this is the technique of revolutions. Revolutions aren't just people going out to the street and trying to protest against the government. If you're going to undo not only the legitimacy of the state, but actually the security apparatus of that state, you either need to begin arming yourself to be able to handle that, and you actually need to get mass defections of the security apparatus of that state. And so we see a massive chasm, and to me, to be quite honest, I don't know whether the turning point where I feel we're at is going to stuff some of these pressures down for a while and see them simmer and come out with convulsions as we move on, or whether the gap is now so large and things are unbridgeable that the protests that Mousavi is calling for actually drive a much more dramatic confrontation. And I think it would be irresponsible for a lot of the observers to say which of these is going to be. I think it's very hard to tell.
Although we are certainly seeing Mousavi calling members of the Basij, our brothers, calling for members of the military and the Revolutionary Guard to join the opposition. So I think that your supposition about what's happening here in terms of the tactics is evident. Steve Clemmons, Senior Fellow at the New America Foundation, publisher of the WashingtonNote.com, required reading around here. Thanks so much for joining us tonight, Steve.
Thank you, Rachel.